Jesse, for your kind introduction and for your excellent comments. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Early in my career, I had the privilege of working closely with someone that some of you may still remember as I look around the room. It was a man named Rex Lee, who was the father of Senator Mike Lee from Utah. Now, he had been a professor and the first dean at the BYU Law School, where I now teach part-time. And as a law professor and dean, he had been a very vocal economic and social conservative. For example, he wrote a book in the 1970s that was widely credited with helping to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. And when Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, Rex was selected as his first Solicitor General, and he took a lot of heat at the time for a lot of the things that he had written as a law professor and as a lawyer prior to that. So it was a bit surprising to many of his fellow conservatives when, as the Solicitor General, he politely declined to try to find an abortion case in which he could urge the Supreme Court to overrule Roe versus Wade, which he viewed as a judicial abomination. But nevertheless, he was not anxious to bring that kind of a case to the court, and his reasoning was simple. He knew the court quite well, having clerked for Justice White and having litigated a few cases there after his clerkship, and he knew the court was not ready to overrule Roe. And so to those who said he should still take a swing at Roe and at least educate the justices on why it was wrong, he replied, well, I'm the Solicitor General, not the Pamphleteer General. And unfortunately, or fortunately, his successor took a different approach, and that decision brought us Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and whatever one thinks of abortion as a matter of policy, or whatever one thinks of Roe versus Wade, the Casey decision was, I think it's fair to say, a significant blow to both federalism and the separation of powers, which are the twin subjects of the practice group that is sponsoring our presentation today. So the temptation to be a pamphleteer rather than a serious lawyer seems to be an occupational hazard for government lawyers, regardless of party affiliation. You may recall, for example, that late in the prior administration, lawyers in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division teamed up with some political appointees in the Education Department to require schools around the country under the banner of Title VII to let students who identify as members of the opposite sex use the bathrooms assigned to the opposite sex. And that was despite very clear language in Title VII itself that allows schools and any institutions covered by Title IX to have separate bathrooms for the two biological sexes. But in a case known as GG versus Gloucester County, two Democratic appointees to the Fourth Circuit sustained the Education Department's interpretation under the soon-to-be-buried Our Deference Doctrine. And I and a now confirmed Fifth Circuit judge were hired to represent the school board in that case, and not too surprisingly, we were able to get the Supreme Court to stay the Fourth Circuit's decision and then to grant certiorari on both the Our Deference issue and the substantive Title IX question in the case. And as luck would have it, the old administration was replaced by the current administration, and the new Education Department decided to follow the statute and revoke the prior bathroom guidance. Well, to me, Gloucester County is a classic example of a Justice Department and a left-leaning administration leaving the role of serious government lawyer and allowing itself to become a pamphleteer for a political cause. Did they really think they could persuade 5 justices to ignore the plain language of Title IX on a question as sensitive as bathrooms? Or did they even think they could persuade 3 justices to do that? And by the way, the Gloucester County case is also an example of the challenges and opportunities faced by a new administration in dealing with pamphleteering by its predecessors. When the new administration took office, merits briefing in the Gloucester County case was already well underway, and so the new Education Department and the Justice Department had to decide very quickly what they wanted to do about the case. And they made a wise choice. It was disappointing for someone who was hoping to argue another case at the Supreme Court, but they made the wise choice to moot the case and to save the fight over our deference for another day. Well, another example of government lawyers succumbing to the pamphleteering temptation was a case called EEOC versus Hosanna Tabor, a Supreme Court case involving the ministerial exemption to anti-discrimination laws. Now, certainly the government in that case could legitimately argue, albeit incorrectly, I think, but they could legitimately argue that the rights of a religious organization's employees to be free from discrimination trumped the organization's religious freedom rights. But the Solicitor General's office in that case went a big step further. It was apparently trying to establish the position that's popular in academic circles that the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause extends no further than freedom to worship. It doesn't actually include exercising religion outside of the of worship spaces. So the Solicitor General's office argued not only that the religious organization there hadn't made a sufficient case for an exemption under the Free Exercise Clause, but the office argued that the Free Exercise Clause, quote, had nothing to do with the issue. Now, not surprisingly, Justice Scalia, when that argument was made at oral argument, bellowed, "That's remarkable." And surprisingly, Justice Kagan, who just a few months earlier had been the boss of the very people who were making that argument, agreed with Justice Scalia that the government's position was remarkable. And not surprisingly, the court squarely rejected that position by a vote of 9-0. Thereby once again illustrating the cost of abandoning sound lawyering in favor of pamphleteering. Perhaps the most amusing example of this phenomenon is a case that I've been handling for the last several years on behalf of the North Carolina legislature, defending two North Carolina laws dealing with the rights of transgender persons in public bathrooms. This was another case in which the Civil Rights Division in the prior administration, joined by the ACLU, tried to impose its view of sound bathroom policy on recalcitrant state and local governments. Well, during a hearing in that case on a motion before a very genteel Southern Republican-appointed district judge, my friend Paul Smith, who successfully argued the Lawrence versus Texas case in the Supreme Court, was representing the ACLU at this hearing. And Paul took the very reasonable position that although he felt his client's right to use the bathroom of their choice trumped the state's interest in limiting access to women's bathrooms to biological women, the state, Paul acknowledged, at least had a legitimate interest in protecting women's bodily privacy. But the Justice Department lawyer who was at the hearing, apparently unable to resist the temptation to be a pamphleteer, took issue with Paul on that point, and she thought that Paul was giving the state legislature too much credit. And she argued that, in fact, there is no legitimate state interest in separating the sexes in public bathrooms. And to illustrate, she pointed to the private school to which she sends her own children, and this school apparently boasts a kind of unisex throne room where children of both sexes gather to do whatever they need to do and just learn to embrace their bodily differences. And so she said, you know, my kid's private school does this and it works out just fine. Well, our traditional Southern judge just looked at her in disbelief, as though to say, wow, you Yankees have lost your senses to a greater degree than I had imagined. And not surprisingly, he ruled against her a few weeks later. Unfortunately, the new administration soon dropped the lawsuit and left it to the ACLU to continue it. Well, the moral of these two stories is twofold. First, if you're representing the government, I would urge you just to be a good lawyer and resist the temptation to be a pamphleteer for your administration's favorite political causes, however worthy they may be. But secondly, if you're opposing the government in litigation and your opponent can't seem to resist the temptation to be a pamphleteer, don't get in their way.